Hello and welcome to the Open Book channel. My name is Oleander, your designated open book, and this is where I share my journey as an author, talk about the craft of writing, the business of being a content creator, and occasionally review really good books, or in this case, really good shows. After my video on cultural commodification in The Curse, I found that I still had a lot to think about. It's rare that I have such a scattered semblance of concepts bouncing around in my head after watching something. Usually, it can consolidate itself under one or two themes, but I just couldn't stop thinking about the characters and all of the interpretations one could form of them. The Curse provides several very complex character pieces that are so flawed that they feel real, which the directing style accentuates, making their conversations and reactions seem off-screen and deeply personal. As it turns out, there is one thesis left in me. It's centered around the Curse's main characters, and I'd like to discuss both the way that I interpreted their presentation and story arcs, but also how, through my lens, the Curse became a different genre altogether, one not listed in its IMDb descriptions. To make things accessible for viewers who haven't seen The Curse, I'm going to give a fairly comprehensive summary of the key main characters before I talk about the dynamics between them. If you've watched the show and don't want a refresher, feel free to skip to the timestamp here, where I go into my cumulative thoughts on the fate of Asher and why The Curse is a genuine modern-day tragedy. This is entirely a spoiler discussion, so if you don't want spoilers, please just don't watch, or go watch The Curse instead and come back later. Okay, so let's get into the characters. First and easiest is Dougie. Dougie is a director that's been tasked with filming footage of Whitney and Asher's work and pitch it into being a full-fledged house-flipping show. Dougie and Asher used to know each other when they were younger, but in their time estranged as adults, Dougie has gotten into a car accident with his wife, who died from the collision. Dougie's sense of grief and responsibility for the incident is complicated, as he was legally over the limit of drunkenness when the crash happened, but he constantly defends that it was absolutely not his fault or because of his impairment. Personally, I found Dougie very hard to relate to. He's certainly chaotic. I'm sure a lot of people found him confusing because of his repeatedly unexplained and sporadic actions, but I can't relate to him mostly due to his aggressiveness. Dougie is portrayed as indisputably lonely. He's lonely because he lost his wife. He's lonely because he has no friends. He's so lonely that he buys booze for a bunch of high school students, then proceeds to get so drunk with them that he forgets having done it at all. He wakes up in a field with cryptic messages that he's left for himself about when and where to go to reunite the teenagers who didn't drink and drive back to their vehicles. Dougie bungles the situation, showing up at a teenager's house at a bad time, and gets confronted by the kid's mother. Dougie slowly pieces together what happened the night before and immediately flips the script, defending himself that he was a good, responsible adult by being the one to get them alcohol and not let them drive home, even going so far as to repugnantly tell the mother that she should thank him. We never get to see the actuality of how everything played out that night, but we the viewers can assume that that is definitely not what happened. Him being the savior, I mean. This situation serves as a great example of Dougie's abrasiveness, which I do not vibe with. He is so lonely that he ugly cries when Asher shirks off hanging out with him because he only views their friendship at that time as a working one, but then Dougie repeatedly does and says things to cause conflict with Asher. Thanks for never inviting me to blank. Like, maybe it's just me, but I tend to be nice to people that I want to like me. This was a unique characteristic for me to watch play out through Dougie, though, to be immediately indignant when he feels like he's in the right. That self-assurance and willingness to evoke conflict is beyond me. The last notable thing about Dougie's relationship with responsibility and alcohol is his fixation on the exact number that constitutes drunk driving. He vows that he'd never drive drunk again after what happened to his wife, but to him, it's more a matter of not being over that pre-designated number of blood alcohol percentage, and he keeps a breathalyzer in his glove compartment so he can always check that. This is an extremely telling part of Dougie, because he never decides not to drink if he plans to drive, will actively convince passengers that he's good for it if they doubt his capacity, then takes pride in being under the limit by a fraction if he feels the need to question himself. He does pull over once when he blows legally drunk and is already driving a date home. The woman commends him for being the kind of guy to pull over, but that's just obvious bullshit. If Dougie was taking responsibility for the incident that killed his wife, he'd never get in a car to drive home after having had drinks in the first place. Or, he'd check his intoxication levels before driving, at the very least. He doesn't care about being responsible so much as he cares about being right. But there is a possible nuance in that dynamic. The curse's character development is hard to read at the best of times. There's the chance that Dougie isn't just an asshole and his lack of foresight is manufactured. Perhaps his grief is deeper than we realize and he wants to recreate the crash to die alongside his wife. Or he wants to recreate the crash so he can indisputably say that it wasn't his fault because he wasn't drunk that time. It's really hard to say. I'd go with the latter. Next, let's talk about Whitney. Whitney and Asher are a fairly new married couple in business together, developing the Espanola area and starring in a new TV show, I can never say this, Fliplanthropy, later named Green Queen. Despite what I said about Dougie, Whitney is arguably even more cringy to watch. That's my subjective opinion, though. The reason I felt this way is because I don't entirely understand Dougie. And although I can't truly speak to Whitney's internal thought process, it's much clearer through what we're shown of Whitney what a narcissist and hypocrite she is. Example A being the reenactment of her getting Asher to help her with a stuck zipper. They have fun getting her out of it the first time, so Whitney gets the idea to redo everything and film it this time, so it'll reflect well on them on social media and promote their eventual show. What was initially meant to showcase them as a quirky, wacky, happy couple comes off as awkward, ingenuine, and leads to a really big fight. Whitney's attempts to curate herself are routinely exposed for the facades that they are. Much like Dougie doesn't use a breathalyzer before driving intoxicated, Whitney's attempts to minimize the negative effects of her gentrification on the community that they're building in are always a band-aid solution. Aside from the obvious, that Whitney supplementing the rent of residents that could no longer afford to live on their properties because of the rising prices around them that she is causing is not the correct solution, both because that's unsustainable and not a guarantee those people can feel safe relying on. But there's also the jeans situation. Whitney hired security for the storefront of a plaza, but balked at the actual enactment of stopping a thief when a pair of jeans got stolen. Her reasoning being that if someone is so desperate they have to steal, they aren't the people that should be punished for it. So, Whitney tells the store owners that instead of calling the police, if something gets stolen, she will personally absorb the cost lost. Whitney gives them her credit card, and every time stock is lost, it's charged to her instead. It's hard to know whether Whitney just doesn't want bad publicity for the area, which would affect the housing market that she's invested so heavily in, but her solution to this feels so devoid of practical, capitalistic thinking that it feels like it's a genuine desire to help, since she's taking it all on herself. You'll find watching The Curse that, although Whitney seems underhanded in her blatant lack of foresight in her own play place, her reaction to many of those consequences are very naive. It's hard not to see that she is trying to do something right sometimes, but can never fully cross the line either to being truly altruistic or fully financially efficient. Whitney openly seems to despise practical capitalistic practices as evil, as seen in her condemning her parents' housing and properties, but she also continuously has to rely on their money to fulfill her own agenda because, well, her practices don't actually work. As you can imagine, people find out that they won't be caught or pursued if they steal from the jean store, and slowly but surely, Whitney incurs huge amounts of personal charges. The Curse does an excellent job of obscuring the line between right and wrong. When blatant theft becomes rampant at the jean store, it's hard not to feel a little bad for Whitney. If her line about not wanting to punish the poor has any truth to it, over not wanting bad publicity about local crime rates, you feel for her. It's unfortunate that human nature is to take advantage of that situation, while, on the other hand, there shouldn't be an overpriced jean store in this location in the first place. Whitney is a very controlling character, but it's hard to tell how much of the manipulations she does are intentional. As I went over in my last article on commodification of culture, I highlighted Whitney and Kara's relationship, and although Whitney wants to use Kara and other indigenous peoples to virtue signal herself into a better light, Whitney also appears genuinely awestruck and oblivious to the overall reality of cultural hierarchies and significance at the same time, as exemplified by this absolute Chad of a guy parodying his own nativehood and moving Whitney to hug him. She doesn't know the difference. As misguided as Whitney is, there are certainly moments I sympathized with her, but that's because I am a certain degree of anal as well. Whitney builds self-contained houses. They have a specific certification that applies to them because of this, but throughout the show, homebuyers and potential homebuyers all want to change the houses in some way that would forfeit that status. As much as a homeowner should have every right to make their home to their own personal desires, I was also sitting there as a viewer irritated that if they wanted those things, they shouldn't be buying one of these very specialized homes. It defeats the point. I would also be frustrated as the home builder and want to control who bought my houses then. That said, and as the curse always does masterfully, there's several sides to every dice. Whitney's homes and general community solutions, as seen in what they implemented at the firefighter station, aren't practical and usually hinder as much as they could ever possibly help. They tried telling this prospective homebuyer, who is sweating his balls off, that he can't install an air conditioner because the house will climatize itself. He doesn't need an air conditioner, when he clearly does. And the house itself takes hours every time you open a door to even meet its designated temperatures again. That episode ends, painfully ironically, on Whitney and Asher going to sleep with their windows open, proving what a hypocrisy their perfect homes are. All of that said, Whitney continuously loses any sympathy that she gains. After a whole episode of being almost rightfully picky with the homeowners they allow, when Asher finds a perfect candidate that Whitney should have loved, because she wasn't the one to find him, she is notably extremely dissatisfied. He rubbed her the wrong way on first impression, and from that point forward, nothing was good enough. Whitney exists on impressions, the ones she makes and the ones others make of her, and that becomes a key factor as to why she sways to Dougie's prodding at accentuating her dissatisfaction with her marriage with Asher for the TV show, and why she grows increasingly unhappy with Asher in general, because other people's ideas of him aren't something that she wants to be aligned with. Once their show is greenlit and Whitney gets to meet with the showrunners, executives, etc., and they start bouncing concepts around, it becomes obvious how they see Asher. Whitney is the Green Queen, and Asher is her jester. Not her king, not her equal, her sidekick. This notably taints Whitney's perception of him, creating a mounting disdain for her husband. So, here we are. Let's talk about Asher. Asher opens the show in a bit of a bad light. In the first episode, he comes off as quite aggressive in an interview with a reporter. As much as it is totally valid for Asher to want to defend Whitney, the reporter is just doing her job, and his approach to confronting her line of dialogue is aggressive. Later in the show, Asher attempts to bribe the reporter with a juicier story so she won't air the bad part of their interview. The reporter eventually takes his offer, but ends their conversation on a note that Asher should understand that what they're doing, gentrifying the area, isn't as great and eco-friendly and amazing as they all want to pretend. To which Asher, again, responds very aggressively. Given this introduction, you might assume Asher is knowingly complicit in these acts, highly aware of them. But the curse reveals very slowly over time that Asher's lines are actually founded on naivety. He doesn't understand that what Whitney and him are doing isn't good enough. He just knows that it is supposed to be good, and Whitney is doing it, so he endorses her fully. Whitney is the metric with which Asher measures all the good in the world. When he goes off on the reporter, it's not out of a defense for their actions. It is a defense for Whitney, though, in an inability to see any fault in her actions. All he sees is a short-term net positive, not the looming implication of what they're doing in the long run. As the curse unfolded, it became clear to me that Asher was coded as being on the autistic spectrum. At first, I chalked it up to being not just awkward, but that he didn't care about general social conventions like, for example, when he is on an espionage mission to get the files he needs to bribe the reporter. As his plan got increasingly harder to pull off, he just continues to push through, partaking in more and more awkward social exchanges and mishaps until he accomplishes his goal. This scene literally gave me so much anxiety as a viewer, and I couldn't tell whether Asher was able to pull it off because he was singular minded and only cared about the goal, or because of something else. Maybe it was that he cared more about saving Whitney's reputation than his friendship with his ex coworker. But the point is that someone who is hypersensitive to social situations like myself couldn't do something like that. I could barely watch it. As time went on, I picked up on other cues. The most notable was Asher at a comedy class. The instructor tells everyone to do something using physical humor, the most basic human point of understanding. Even if we don't speak the same language, we can find someone farting at a bad time funny. As they go around the room, people do gestures that inspire a bit of a chuckle from others in the circle. Then Asher does his, and the room is silent. And that's when it clicked for me that Asher isn't different simply because his priorities are hidden. He's awkward because his understanding of social situations isn't neurotypical. When Asher repeatedly makes the most base, sometimes tasteless jokes imaginable in a situation he thinks calls for a joke, it isn't that he's lacking a good sense of humor necessarily, it's that he doesn't completely understand why some things are funny. Asher is just regurgitating context clues he picked up and acting how he thinks he's supposed to, aka masking. When Dougie randomly apologizes to Asher for bullying him when they were younger, Asher seems naive and confused by the apology, not having understood that it was bullying at all but just the guys fooling around. Asher also records and re-listens to conversations he's had, taking notes so he can better understand and interact with people next time he faces a similar situation. All of these instances of not understanding social cues and trying to understand social interactions is what coded Asher to me as neurodivergent, but that's just my interpretation of his character. I could be wrong. There are multiple instances in the curse where Asher doesn't respond to other people doing objectively wrong behaviors correctly himself. From playing along with Whitney faking their sweater exchange, not calling the comedy class instructor out for being the one in the wrong for lingering on a penis joke, not further criticizing Dougie for essentially driving drunk, and most notably, as is exposed in the video that he gives to the reporter, laughing along with a superior at a casino when they registered a gambling addict at their slots. And Asher tries to explain himself to Whitney, but he can't. From the viewer's perspective, it's a simple, morally gray thing for Asher if he admitted that it was my job or the moral high ground. He had to pick one. But since Whitney doesn't value that explanation, Asher accepts her assessment. She's right. He's the bad person, and his reaction in the moment is condemnable regardless of the context. Asher and Whitney have a terribly unhealthy dichotomy. Asher sees himself as nothing without Whitney's validation, and Whitney comes to resent him for that blind dedication. And my point about Whitney shown in their confrontation at the end of episode 9. Now, despite Asher putting Whitney on such a pedestal, he still proclaims, "I see you." But Asher's dedication is, in a way, a lie. He can try to see her for who she truly is. He can love her to the moon and back, and he can see in hindsight where he did something Whitney was displeased with. At the time, though, when Whitney gave him this face and this line, but, he didn't, though. He can't read her. Throughout the curse, there's actually some great growth from Asher. After his declaration of love to Whitney, he grows more assertive with others around him when he notes a moral dilemma, actually sticking up for what he believes is right, as what Whitney has taught him is right, but also he's still too enamored with Whitney as an ideal that he can't understand her desires. As you may understand from my summary of Whitney, she is not malicious, but her entire presentation is a front. If she really cared and was truly a good person, she would be dealing with issues on a systematic level and not slapping a band-aid on everything that comes her way so she can continue to do what she wants. Asher has taken that image of her that she presents to other people at face value. Yes, she is trying to do some good things, but he is essentially accepting what she is telling and not what she is showing. As they move on with their lives as the show airs and they have a baby on the way, Asher presents Whitney with a baby gift, giving a property they own away to the tenants whom they have formed a slight landlord-renter bond with. Asher thinks that doing something this altruistic will please Whitney because that's the person she presents herself as being. But again, look at her face. You tell me, is she pleased? Mm-mm. I subscribe to the theory that what happens to Asher at the very end of the show is what he proposed in episode 9, that if Whitney didn't want him, he would disappear. This is ironic, but beautiful in lieu of Asher's continuous incapacity to see Whitney for who she is, or apart from the pedestal that he's put her on. Neither of them understand why he's suddenly seemingly lost gravity, but it is a literal enactment of Asher's proclamation. Unlike Whitney, he is doing action over words. I also really love that the way the emergency responders treat Asher is a mirror to how Asher and Whitney have acted in terms of their solutions to their gentrification of the area, just plowing forward instead of listening to what the victims actually need. If Asher's desire to disappear when Whitney doesn't want him anymore is true, and the cause of his death in space, then although he set the curse on himself, Asher is the victim of this narrative. He wasn't perfect, no, but many of his flaws could be correlated to his inherent inability to read people. Asher had blind spots to the effects of their business practices because he loved Whitney to the point of worship. He believed she was the most altruistic person he'd ever met. She's not. And not being able to see that, not being able to see her as the person she was what killed him. Chasing a goodness that didn't exist because he is overly literal is what led to Asher's unusual death. So now I ask, does that not sound absolutely tragic? To assert the curse as a tragedy, I would like to compare it to that of Shakespeare's play Othello. And please, I know it's not a very direct comparison. It's been many, many years since I read Othello myself. But in that general vagueness of what I do remember, I ended up thinking about how the characters line up in some ways. To boil Othello down for you, it's the story of a black military man named Othello who gets married to a Venetian woman, Desdemona, which sparks varying degrees of communal displeasure from Desdemona's father, her other wannabe suitors, but most of all, Othello's stand-bearer and not-so-best bro named Iago. As it turns out, Iago is a jealous, two-faced son of a bitch who hates Othello for his success, so Iago plants seeds of doubt in Othello that Desdemona is cheating on him. Othello ends up killing Desdemona, and when Iago's schemes come to light that Desdemona was completely innocent, Othello kills himself. What prompted my brain to make this comparison between Othello and the curse was the archetype of Iago. In this comparison, Dougie is Iago, but the other roles switch. Whitney is Othello, and Asher is Desdemona. Dougie is an instigator, much like Iago. Dougie is impossible to read as a character by those around him. Iago is most notable as a villainous character because, until his schemes are exposed at the end, he maintains a reputation for honesty. Likewise, Dougie constructs himself so he never has to accept responsibility for his actions. Specifically drunk driving, Dougie says he won't drink so he can designate a driver Asher home, but then orders his beverages to be alcoholic to the waiter on the side. When he blows just under the limit, Asher has nothing to do but awkwardly respond, "Nice." Because the morality of what Dougie is doing is then defined by the breathalyzer, not Dougie's negligence, or the fact that he had alcohol in his system at all when he shouldn't have. Similarly, Dougie convinces his date not to get an Uber and that he was sober, only to have to pull over when he blew legally drunk into the breathalyzer. The breathalyzer isn't used as a tool to prevent mistakes. It is a device used by Dougie to put the responsibility on the passengers for getting in the car with him in the first place, and to be commended for doing the right thing by pulling over if he is drunk. Dougie says that he's burdened by the crash that killed his wife, while actively never changing his behaviors, regardless of whether his inebriation actually caused it. Another great example of Dougie's Iago facade is that he becomes fixated with trying to get the little girl that cursed Asher to do it again. Nearly drunk, he drives Asher to the family's house and enters the little girl's room under the guise of changing out the batteries in a smoke detector. Very, very creepy behavior. But the point I'm getting to is that when they leave, Dougie acts like he was doing Asher a favor by pushing the curse thing so hard. And when that seems like that's not going to fly with Asher, Dougie diverts responsibility of him being the whole orchestrator of the situation by accusing Asher of being equally guilty because he went along with it. Basically, if it was so wrong, why didn't you stop me then? Asher doesn't quite know how to respond to that. If I exclaimed that you handed me a tissue instead of a battery, then not only would your weird lies get exposed, but I'd be on bad terms with my tenants for letting someone like you in their house. This is not the first time Asher has been confronted by someone getting blame put on him for having a regular response, but one which he can't morally justify on his own. I.e., when the casino footage is revealed, Whitney confronts Asher about never doing anything good if she didn't make him. From Dougie to Whitney to his comedy class coach and more, Asher continuously has other people's responsibilities shoveled on his shoulders. Aside from being a two-faced contradiction of a man, Dougie struck me as an Iago because of his interactions with Whitney. Much like Iago whispers into Othello's ear about Desdemona's supposed wrongdoings, Dougie slowly manipulates Whitney into fixating on her marriage, developing her discontent with Asher to use as drama in the show. Personally, as an extended theory towards the ending's meaning, I think the curse existed inside of Asher and not Nala. When Nala cursed him, it was more a matter of Asher's own literalness that developed into something tangible. Therefore, when Asher believes he is the curse, and proclaims that he will disappear when Whitney doesn't want him around anymore, he is cursing himself to that fate, which comes true. It is Asher's devotion that condemns him. It is Whitney's discontent in their marriage that causes him to float away into the stratosphere. It is Dougie's manipulations that lead to friction in their marriage, causing both Asher's obsessive certainty in curses and Whitney's disgust for her husband, resulting in I'm begging you, stop her! Does that not sound like a modern tragedy? As much as Dougie has some relatable moments, he is kind of the villain of this whole story, the Iago of the curse. Whitney isn't blameless. I mean, she's a very manipulative person, but in regards to how her discontent with Asher grows, I can at least kind of sympathize with her. Who would like being praised as the Green Queen whose husband is nothing but her jester? And there's nothing for her to do about that. She can't change other people's perceptions of her husband. She can only be displeased with them and consequently with him. Asher isn't a perfect character either, but out of all three of them, he seems to have the most personal growth throughout the show. Even though he doesn't see Whitney as a person over the ideals she presents to the world, it's not inherently wrong for him to be in pursuit of achieving goodness, or rather, believing in her and that she is doing good things. Throughout the curse, Asher progresses towards being able to assert his morals in situations that he would have otherwise remained compliant to. As the only true character that gained moral awareness, and whose final act was to gift a house to a family, is it not extremely tragic that he's the one who dies from the neglect of others? More so, that Dougie and Whitney are going to benefit from Asher's death with further fame and will never be held accountable for their bad behaviors. Honestly, to further Dougie's condemnation as an Iago character, I'm not entirely convinced that he didn't subconsciously orchestrate the whole thing. Of course, probably not expecting that Asher would manifest the curse in that way, but at the very least, ruining Asher's relationship and life out of pettiness, because he's so lonely. He forced a confession out of Asher that he didn't think he could exist without Whitney, and yet, Dougie actively, maliciously tried to drive a wedge between them. He didn't care that Asher's undying devotion to Whitney might lead him to suicidal ideation. He just wanted a show. Pun intended. Lastly, if my theory about Asher being the one with supernatural capabilities isn't true, and curses just exist in this universe, then it was indisputably Dougie who killed Asher all along.
I curse you.
Yeah, so, sorry that this video took so long to make. It took a lot of time and research and gathering clips. So, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. This is like the largest project that I've undertaken so far on this channel. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I brought something new to the conversation surrounding the curse and all of its hidden meanings. Please leave me a comment telling me about all your theories on the curse. I would love to hear them. It's such a nuanced show to dissect. If you appreciated the work that I put into this, please leave me a like or subscribe. If you'd like to support me or this channel, I'll have a link in the description below for all of my socials. An extra special thank you to everyone who supported me. You're the best. I hope everyone's having a great 2025 so far, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.